Part 2, Chapter 9 of If All These Young Men by Romer Wilson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part 2, London. Chapter 9, Sacred Groves. In vain men love the idol of their dreams, and if from time to time the exquisite loveliness looks out of the face of this man or that woman, the owner of the divine expression stands before, and joins with human error to keep apart the divinities. Then desire to tear off the me and you excludes every other desire, but the defensive flesh blows out a cold fog, and the perfection hides again in its woods and forests, not less enchanting because unseen, nor less desired because lost. The voice keeps silent. It is not usual to cry out, "Stop! I love your divinity with mine. We are a part of the genius of the world." Many ceremonies and much wearisome patience keep the lover in anguish, and long before the delight is won, the owner of the sweet object has become disgusted with the suitor who is driven mad by longing. No despair, no cruelty, no insensibility can destroy his fidelity, and though his body pursues a common course, his soul lingers until life kills his aspirations in those localities where the unattainable light has flickered, which are henceforth sacred groves to him. James Blanchard sat upon the long seat in Mary Laurie's sitting room at an evening party. His pince nez flashed back the light of the lamp as he stiffly turned his head to finish his sentence to Mr. Rudyard Lewis. All his beautiful teeth gleamed as between the words smile after smile broke over his round red face, and when he finished speaking he threw up his head a little way and laughed. But before the laugh was over went on speaking again in a tenor voice full of soft spluttering p's and b's that suited his intonation. His little fat hands were resting on his knees, his elbows were akimbo, and he gently moved his fat body a little forward or a little backward, according to the interest he felt in what he was saying. Tonight he glistened with good health. His cheeks, eyes, thin rough red hair, and slight red mustache shone with the exuberance of youth and happiness. To the eye, James Blanchard was a man of the world and of circumstance, but in secret to be this was an ambition which he had not yet attained. For the world to which he appeared to belong he had respect and curiosity, and was gratified when those who owned it treated him as co-heir of the ages. At 27 he had acquired almost all the details of his education, and reached the highest level to which he was going to rise in personal philosophy. He was about to collect the last facts before formulating his order of life. Nevertheless, he still found himself a stranger in the world into which he had been born, and this alien state gave him an incomparable charm, childlike and entrancing. His enthusiasm to see how the world worked was not altogether hidden by an easily dispelled pessimism, and an acknowledgment of his own triviality and worthlessness which he did not hear echoed in the depths of his heart. He found himself as all good and sane persons find themselves, fundamentally beautiful. He loved himself sincerely, and wished to do the very best for himself that he could, and this love was neither despicable nor shameful. The little room was full of people, but as we are all alone or accompanied in a crowd, so Blanchard was only there with Amaryllis, in whose company he had arrived and would depart, and with Mary Laurie, who was in every respect save that of flesh and blood, his sister. In his heart he had a heaven where he went when he was miserable, to reinstate himself as a happy man, and here he sought and found that nameless creature with whom he passed his secret hours, and whose counterpart he hoped to find on earth. She was a woman of perfect beauty, but he had never seen her face. Vague and lovely he thought her, presiding and obedient, a goddess, yet possessing only his will. A shadow of her had fallen upon Amaryllis. But it had passed, and now since she was not there, nor in Susan, where he had hoped to find her, he believed she was unearthly. But when he thought of giving his life to this or that woman, she would cry out, "Do not forsake me, I am the true light." He knew that he and she together were a god and goddess, but he lived in a world, and in the world he was a man, and Amaryllis a woman. He smiled to himself and said, a little cynically, "Well, I can sport with Amaryllis in the shade." He looked at Amaryllis now, where she sat in a big blue armchair, fair, Flemish, and vigorous. Suddenly the door opened, and Susan and Josephine came into the room. His shame was rent from the top to bottom, and he blushed but cried, "Hello, Josephine! Hello, Susan!" and wagged his hand at them. All the time he talked to Mr. Lewis, whom he admired very much. There was no doubt that he loved Susan, but the divine jealousy of his ideal sprang down upon him whenever he wished he could marry her. He was not his own master in those days. He had not yet sacrificed his Iphigenia, nor bought commonplace freedom at the price of dreams. Often he had murmured to Susan and to himself, "I am a flirt, I have no heart," but fortunately at the same time he thought the almond blossom will one day cover even the dead branches of the almond tree. When first Josephine entered the room, she thought for a moment that ugly black-eyed women, divided from the world by a barrier of possessive men, sat in a row along the wall, but this was not the case. They vanished, and she heard James Blanchard's voice saying, "Hello, Josephine. Hello, Susan," and Mary Laurie's high tones, soft as woodland shadows and clear as woodland water, murmuring, "Well, how are you both? It is a long time since I saw you two children." As Josephine answered, "We are both very well. We have just come from the country," she caught a glimpse of Amaryllis's opaque blue eyes and the pseudo Gladstone collar of Mr. Franklin. Josephine stood where she was for a minute, prepared to discourse upon the beauties of the country all the evening. But Mary withdrew, so she sat down in the nearest chair, wondering what it was that made the thousand things she had in her mind of no interest to other people. She looked around her to see who was there. Beside Blanchard, Jewish Mr. Lewis, Amaryllis, Susan, Mary Laurie, and Mr. Franklin, there was a young man with a Russian beard, who sat in a corner staring before him with his knees drawn up, stroking the wrist of each long white hand with the fingertips of the other, and at his feet, with her back to him, also staring blankly before her, sat a beautiful alabaster girl modeled after a young Florentine. Josephine looked at all these people very narrowly, and went into great considerings about them, leaving the company to continue in its social way, making itself pleasant, as it is called, an art which Susan practised to perfection and James Blanchard was anxiously acquiring. The only person there who had no social veneer and yet was more congenial than the others was Mary Laurie. Everybody wished to sit beside her and to bask in the glamour of her personality. Where she was, everybody was content to be, and though James Blanchard used to say, "Mary is stupid," and Susan was of opinion that she had no intellect, and everybody in the room admitted tacitly that she was no warrior of the mind and had neither brilliance of insight nor understanding, yet they all felt that if all their worth together were put in the scales against hers, hers would weigh the balance. She was vague yet capable, shadowy yet substantial, plain yet beautiful. It was impossible to say too much for or against her. Thus at least thought Josephine as she looked at her. She has 32 years of other people's love and passion and youth and beauty hidden behind a transparent woman, said Josephine to herself. She's not flesh and blood. It seemed to her that in the country Mary must dissolve into sunshine and mist, but in London she became again a human being with a most enchanting smile, and behind her lay her experience, stretching away over those who had surrendered to her charm, out into the far regions of her dissolution. Josephine meditated in this sentimental manner, and felt lonely enough to cry, until Mr. Franklin came and sat down by her on the floor. He looked wilder and more Cromwellian than usual. Passion, not unlike that which consumed Wesley, seemed to burn in his glance, but whether the flame within him was trimmed by the hand of God or by his own, it was impossible to tell. "I have just seen a girl," he said in final, decisive, and intense tones, as he flung himself into an uncomfortable position upon the floor. "A young woman, I suppose you would call her, but that does not matter. A girl of about 35 years of age, as young as the day she bore her first child, and that must have been a considerable time ago, with such a beautiful face, a face that made you want to kiss her." "Did you kiss her?" asked Josephine, not a little indulgently, although Mr. Franklin was, as the saying is, old enough to be her father. "No, I gave her a shilling, which she probably spent at the public house. Are you still working for a miserable pittance in a government department?" Mr. Franklin's collar gleamed in the light of the shaded lamp, an emblem of Victorianism of which he fancied himself the sole survivor. As he ceased speaking, he suddenly turned his hawk like face up to Josephine, and with a piercing glance said, "Why do you work?" Work is difficult, but life is more difficult." He did not lower his tone, but made the pronouncement as if he were a voice speaking. "Is it?" she muttered, and saw the difficulty of such scum of life as floated upon the war as James Blanchard's antagonism for her, but she quickly subdued the idea. "Yes," he continued, with that intensity which misled women when he first met them into thinking he was impassioned by them, "it is the most difficult thing in life, to live it well." At this point Mary Laurie came over again, and Josephine, with benign affection in her heart for Mr. Franklin, turned towards her. Both Mary and she were very fond of him. He enriched the repertoire of humanity, and his kindness was upon the heroic scale. "You two people are always so fine," said Mary, looking at Josephine's dress and then at Susan's. Susan was sitting in Mr. Lewis's place talking to Blanchard. "We like him fine," replied Josephine, touching her dress, to which she referred as she spoke. She wished ardently, like many people, that Susan and Blanchard would make a match of it, and be the most charming urban couple in the world. "You are so very smart," said Mary, kindly, pinching the stuff of Josephine's dress. "And you," she went on, turning to Mr. Franklin, "what do you think is going to happen to us all?" Josephine forgot to listen to his reply, and began straining to hear what Susan and Blanchard were talking about. At first she could not catch what they said, for they were right across the room, and everybody was talking. She thought, "How thin Blanchard's dreams and mine look in the light of Susan's admirable sense. She's no fantasias in her mind, no sloppy Garden of Eden. She's the world to which we don't belong. Human sanity and human emotions are enough for her. She has no visionary humbug to confuse her, nor ideal nobody to shame her honorable sense of fitness." The antiphanous thought came to her: perhaps she finds nothing divine. The general conversation broke, and she heard Susan now say, "No, really, do tell me about her. I love Ethel, dear Ethel. I love the way she dances. I love the way she kicks." "And the orchestra goes Brrrrup," laughed Blanchard. "The conventions of the music hall are immense." "Ha ha!" laughed Susan, and Mr. Blanchard put his head up a little, like a dog barking, and laughed, "Ha! Yes!" opening his mouth wide and drawing his lower lip over his bottom teeth, after which he smiled again with words in his mouth. "Who are you talking about?" cried Mary Laurie, her face all of a coming and going beneath the fine soft skin. "Ethel Levy," said Susan. "I feel as if I were quite mad when you two begin bringing out your experiences in the great world." "Ha ha!" laughed Susan again. "If I went and told you what I dreamed last night." Both she and Blanchard played up to Mary's ignorance of music halls. "When you two begin singing your songs," went on Mary, "I feel as if I were a mere child who had wandered into a queer world." "It was only a beautiful picture in a beautiful golden frame," sang Blanchard, and at the end imitated a cork popping to emphasize Mary's remoteness from the popular conception of pleasure. Everybody except the pseudo Russian and the alabaster girl laughed, and Mary said softly, "Quite mad, all quite mad." Josephine laughed loud, and then addressed James directly. "You haven't been taken for the army yet, James." "No," he grunted, and, blushing deep red, turned away his head. Everybody knew that he had no cause to blush, as, in spite of his rich appearance, he was too delicate to join the army. But Josephine was aware that whatever she had said would have caused the shame to boil out of his heart in precisely the same way. He was ashamed because he was sure that she knew him to the dregs of his soul, and that however he might go on there at the evening party, she could tell what his mind was doing inside his head and his heart doing inside his body. "Don't you think," said Mary Laurie to Amaryllis suddenly, "that the world wants a good washing?" "I think it is perfectly extraordinary how people exist as they do," replied Amaryllis with emphasis. "Nothing will be right till we've had a revolution, and our kind is shot," said Josephine, though she did not mean it. "What sort of a revolution?" said Amaryllis. "A bloody revolution." "How fierce! I don't think I am of the opinion exactly that I ought to be shot," said Mary, smiling all over her large face, and letting her eyes look off into the distance through those translucent glasses of hers. There was so much herself that part of her charm was lost without them. "We'd go with the rest," grunted Josephine. "Who are the rest?" asked Mary vaguely. "The rest of the detestable intellectual snobs." "Yes," Mary replied slowly with long pauses, enunciating her words more clearly than usual. "I think perhaps you are right." We are snobs, and we do think ourselves too splendid, and we are not so very splendid, but I don't think I want to be shot very much. Do you?" "Life's nothing to me," growled Josephine, speaking the truth. "I am not as splendid or as brave as you young creatures, I think," concluded Mary. Josephine's truth put an end to the conversation, as truth always does, and Mary now moved away to talk to Mr. Lewis. "Well, Rudyard, and what have you been doing with yourself all this long time? Working until you cannot stand or see, and do not want your dinner, I suppose," Josephine heard her say, and then, closing her ears, Josephine sat back in silence like the pair in the corner and waited patiently for half an hour. At the end of half an hour her patience was exhausted. She rose, made a sign to Susan, said good bye to Mary Laurie, and without noticing anybody else, left the room. When Susan and she were stumbling down the dark little stairs, she said, "Pa, what a boring evening. James was horrible to me." "Oh," cried Susan, "Amaryllis was there. Amaryllis was there." "Yes, my sweet, it was dreary. We won't go there again." "No, no," Susan said, "I want to. I like Mary. I mustn't be a hermit or I shall lose everything." "She don't like me," Josephine snapped. "Come, Susan, let me take my little pet quickly home." In Fleet Street it was raining hard, and a thick wet mist filled the air. It was bitterly cold, and all the people appeared forlorn and outcast. The rain dripped down like the blood of a slaughtered nation, and the fog closed in thick with the possibility of England's ruin and the ruin of humanity in an endless war. End of Part 2, Chapter 9. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.